Ricardo. Welcome tonight. It's wonderful to have you here. Can I say a few words about Dharma etiquette that maybe people don't know? When the teacher comes, we usually stand up. It's a respect for our teacher. We always do that. When we sit, we don't put the feet toward the teacher because it's looked at as unrespectful. So let's just do that. And then in the card, Leda had put a paper. If you want to be on the mailing list, you put your name on the paper at the table. So, thank you very much.
So good evening. And I'd hoped that we would have copies of some prayers that I put together that we could say together, but I think something happened and they weren't made, so we'll try to do that for next week. So for tonight, we'll just do some meditation to start our class tonight. The purpose of saying prayers anyway is to put ourselves into a good state of mind, have a positive state of mind, a positive motivation for being present during teachings, listening to teachings, and so forth. So we can do that on our own, just with some meditation. So first of all, make yourselves comfortable. So just take a look at your body and see if there's tension anywhere in your body. If you're holding on to tension, sometimes we hold tension in our shoulders or back or neck. So if you do notice tension anywhere in your body, see if you can relax, release the tension, let it go. So one thing you could do is imagine that the tension melts and flows down and sinks into the earth beneath us. So just let the tension flow out of you and disappear into the earth. And the same with mental tension. If there's any disturbing thoughts in your mind left over from things that may have happened during the day today or any other time in the past. So see if you can let go of those as well. At least put them aside for now. And try to just let your mind be here in the present place, present moment, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future. So that's not always easy to do, but one thing that can help us to put our mind in the present is to pay attention to our breathing, because our breathing is happening in the present. It's not in the past or the future, but it's right here, right now. So be aware of your breathing, your breath flowing in and flowing out. Try to be aware of the full duration of the breath as it's coming in and then as it's going out. And do this for one breath after another. And if the mind wanders away from the breath and gets caught up thinking about something else, as soon as you notice that, bring it back to the breath. And if you want, you can count your breaths. It can help to stay focused on the breathing. So now, before we begin to look at the actual teachings, start the talk for tonight, let's take a few more minutes to see if we can generate a positive state of mind, a positive motivation for being here. So the very best motivation or intention that we can have is what we call altruism, which means wishing to help others, wishing to benefit others. So you may already have such a motivation in your mind. That was your reason for coming here. But in case you don't, we can take a few minutes to try to bring that kind of motivation into our mind. So one way we can do that is to just think about how we ourselves, deep in our mind or in our heart, have the wish to be happy and to not suffer. So this is the sort of underlying motivation for just about everything we do in our life. It's an attempt to find happiness, peace, good experiences, and to avoid unhappiness, pain, problems, and bad experiences. And there's nothing wrong with feeling this way. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. We actually have the right, it's like a human right to be happy. And we shouldn't have to suffer. Suffer is actually something wrong, something mistaken. So it's just a question of finding the right way to be happy and the right way to avoid suffering. But that wish itself, that basic wish is completely okay, completely right. Now this is something we share with everyone else. Every human being, every living being, everyone who has a mind has within their mind this same wish to be happy, to have good experiences, and to not suffer, to not have bad experiences. So if you can feel how nice it would be, how wonderful it would be if everyone, every being could have the happiness they wish for and could be free from the suffering that they don't wish to experience. How wonderful that would be. Now, it may seem unrealistic. It may seem like too big of a job to actually happen, but it's not impossible. According to Buddhism, everyone has the potential to experience perfect peace and happiness and to be completely free of suffering. That's really what Buddhism is all about, how to show us the way to do that. And we can make a contribution towards that by working on our own mind, learning to decrease the causes of suffering and increase the causes of happiness within ourselves. And then we can do as much as we can to bring that to others, to share that with others, to help others to also find the real causes of happiness and avoid the causes of suffering. So see if you can feel that is your reason for being here and listening to this talk, and in general learning the Dharma, practicing the Dharma. It's so that you can start working on your own mind, increase the happiness, peace, and positive aspects of your mind, decrease the unhappiness and the negative aspects of the mind, so that you can then be of benefit to others, to help others to do the same. Okay. So when you feel ready to, you can relax and open your eyes. Oh dear. So prepared some notes for the class that I'm teaching tonight. I don't know if did you receive them? Martina was supposed to mail them out.
Yes.
Some of you got them? Yeah? Okay. It might take us a little while to get going in these. Okay, so my thought was to put together some materials, at least an outline, and maybe also some notes for the classes that we're doing on Thursday night. And also, I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but the classes that are happening on Thursday nights, there will also be one Saturday a month that we will do the same teachings. And this Saturday will sometimes be held here, but sometimes in one of the other centers in the Nordic Baltic region. So this Saturday, I'm actually going to Helsinki, and I'll be teaching there. It's a continuation of this Thursday night class. And those who wish to follow this class can come here on Saturday, and there'll be, I don't know, somehow video. You can watch the video and participate in that way online. So we'll give more information about that later. So if you are interested in following this class week after week, then it might be good to either print out, hopefully, I don't know what happened, why some of you didn't get the notes, but print out the notes, or if you have like a tablet, you could have them, on your tablet and read them if you want to save paper. You could do it in that way. So if you didn't get them by now and have them for tonight, they should be in the email, and you should be getting them later. So I sent a set of notes, and I also sent this sutra, which is called, it's actually the first sutra that the Buddha taught. I mentioned it last week in last week's slide presentation, and the name of the sutra in Pali is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, which translates into English as setting in motion the wheel of Dharma. So sometimes we call it the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, very first teaching that the Buddha gave. And so I sent that to you for you to read, and we will be referring to it during this module. So we're now on the first module of this this subject called Exploring Buddhist Philosophy, and the first module is called The Buddha and His Teachings. So last week we started by looking at the Buddha's life and just briefly at his very first teaching, in which he explained the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So for the remainder of this module, which will just run for about 4 weeks, another 3 weeks, we will go into more detail with the Four Noble Truths, which we looked at just briefly last week. And so in the notes which I sent, there's an outline that just covers the main topics we will be covering in the module. So the first topic is Buddha's life, and then the second is his first teaching, the Four Noble Truths. So we looked at that last week. And so tonight I'll continue with the outline with point number 3, which is a general introduction to the Four Noble Truths, and why it's important to know about them, how beneficial it is to to know about them and think about them, reflect on them, and so on. Okay, so, and I'm also basing much of the material I'm using in the class on this book, which is called The Four Noble Truths by Geshe Tashi Tsering, who is a teacher in our center, our sister center in London. And he's been teaching for many years now a program called The Foundation of Buddhist Thought, which has 6 modules. The first module is about the Four Noble Truths. So this book is related to that. So it's a really excellent book. You don't have to have it, but if you have it, then you can use that as we're going through the class. And it gives a lot more information about the Four Noble Truths. So just to quote, to read a quotation from this book about the benefit and importance of knowing about the Four Noble Truths. Geshe Tashi says, "The Four Noble Truths lay down the blueprint for the entire body of the Buddha's thought and practice and set up the basic framework of the individual's path to enlightenment. They encapsulate all of Buddhist philosophy. Therefore, studying, meditating, and fully understanding this teaching is very important, because without an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, it is impossible to fully integrate the concepts and practices of Buddhism into our daily lives." So, in brief, we could say that if we have a good understanding of the Four Noble Truths, then this will give us an understanding of the essential message of all the Buddha's teachings. So it's said that, I mean, the Buddha taught for like 45 years, which is a long time, and there's a lot of teachings, a huge amount of teachings. But the Four Noble Truths is like a framework in which all the other teachings that the Buddha gave can be inserted. So if we have a good understanding of the Four Noble Truths, then everything else we learn about Buddhism will be able to slot it in to one of these four. So it gives us a kind of map or an outline or a framework for understanding everything else that the Buddha taught. And also in terms of our practicing Buddhism, because that's the real point, is to practice what the Buddha taught, not just to have understanding, intellectual understanding of it, but to actually practice it. So learning about the Four Noble Truths can also help us to at least start practicing the Buddha's teachings, to start making the first steps along the Buddhist path. So I'd just like to say something about the terminology, because in English, and probably other languages as well, these four are usually called the Four Noble Truths, but that's not such a exact, precise translation of the term. In Tibetan language, the term for these Four Noble Truths literally means the four truths of noble ones. So that's a more precise way of translating it. And just to explain the terms, the word truth, we probably, when we hear the word truth, we probably think of it as something kind of abstract, just some kind of idea, concept, abstract thing. But in Buddhism, a truth isn't necessarily just something abstract. It can actually be a phenomena, physical phenomena, as we'll learn later on. So, for example, our bodies are included in the First Noble Truth. Our bodies and our minds as well are actually the truths of suffering, which we'll learn later. So that means that a truth isn't just some kind of idea, some kind of abstract thing, but it can actually be a phenomena, physical phenomena. And in general, a truth in Buddhism is something which is in accordance with the teachings of the Buddha. So the Buddha described phenomena, explained phenomena as he saw them, as he understood them. So he explained things the way he saw them, and we who follow the Buddha believed that the Buddha saw things correctly, that his mind was free of ignorance and delusion and distorted ways of seeing things. So we believe, of course, not everyone believes this, but we believe that the Buddha saw things as they are, and then he described things as they really are. And so when he explained the Four Noble Truths, he was explaining things as they really are, as opposed to seeing things in a distorted way. I mean, the idea in Buddhism is that those of us who are not Buddhas, who are not enlightened, don't see things as they are. We see things in a distorted way, in a mistaken way. And that's our problem. That's why we have suffering. That's why we have problems, because we don't see things as they are. And so these four things that the Buddha spoke about in his first teaching, and he called these four truths, are truths. That means they exist as they are. They are true. They're not distorted. They're not false. So that's one meaning of the word truth. And also, the Four Noble Truths are phenomena that when we understand them, when we get a correct understanding of them, they will enable us to clear up our minds, free our minds from ignorance and distorted ways of thinking and afflictive emotions and so on, things that make us suffer. And by clearing up those from our mind, clearing those out of our mind, we'll free ourselves from suffering and from problems. So that's another reason for calling them truths. And then the second term, noble ones. Okay, so the term noble actually refers to certain types of beings. The Sanskrit term for these beings is Arya. And Arya is a person who has attained a direct realization of ultimate truth, which we sometimes call emptiness or selflessness. So it's the true nature of things, the actual way that things exist. So when somebody, by practicing meditation and following the path, finally gains a correct and direct understanding or realization of the actual way in which things exist, then that person becomes what we call an Arya. So an Arya isn't necessarily an enlightened being, but it's like a very important stage on the path to enlightenment. So Aryas are sometimes called noble ones. And that's kind of a translation of Arya. So these four things then are truths in the perspective of Aryas. Those who've gained a correct realization of things, those who see things as they are. So for them, from their point of view, these four things are true. Whereas for those of us who are not Aryas, who are ordinary beings, non-Arya beings, we may not see these things as true. So just to give an example of that, our bodies and our minds and most of the things in the world around us are examples of the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. And the reason for this is because they are produced from kind of mistaken causes, karma and afflictions, which we'll look at more later. They come into existence due to karma and delusions. And therefore, they are said to be contaminated or impure. They're imperfect or faulty, and full of problems, and not truly satisfying. So that's the truth. That's the reality of all the things in the world. Our bodies, our minds, and the things in the world around us. They are very much imperfect, and they don't lead to real happiness and peace and satisfaction. They lead to suffering. So this is the truth, the reality. But ordinary people who are not Aryas, don't see things like that. Instead, ordinary people see bodies and minds and things in the world around us as desirable, as worth being attached to, as worth grasping at, and so on. So people grasp at all of these things with the wish for happiness, with the wish for peace, for satisfaction, for lasting happiness, which is actually impossible. It's impossible to get real, true, lasting happiness by being attached to and grasping at bodies and the things in the world around us, these ordinary phenomena. So it's as though we ordinary beings are living in a dream, trying to get happiness and satisfaction out of things which are not capable of giving real happiness and satisfaction. And this is because we don't see the truth, the true nature, the reality of all of these things, that they are actually in the nature of suffering. So Aryas, noble beings, on the other hand, don't fall into this problem. They see all of these things as they really are. They see them as in the nature of suffering. And so they don't have unrealistic expectations of them. They don't see them as the source of lasting peace and happiness. Does that make sense? I mean, some of these things maybe don't make sense, but hopefully as we go along, they will become more clear. So I was just trying to explain the meaning of the term noble truth, that it actually, a more correct translation is a truth for a noble one, for an Arya, a being who sees things as they are. Okay, so now we'll go into the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. So I'm going to start talking about this tonight, and probably won't be able to finish it tonight, but I'll continue on Saturday, and talk more about the first noble truth, and also do meditations, lead some meditations on the first noble truth. And probably also on Saturday, we'll have a chance to go through the second noble truth, the truth of origin, because we have quite a few sessions on Saturday. So this first noble truth then about suffering, this topic is not easy. It's challenging because I think that on the one hand, we do know that there is suffering. There's suffering in our own lives. There's suffering in the lives of other people. There's suffering in the world around us. So we do know that it's there, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to look at suffering and be aware of suffering without becoming depressed or feeling despair or feeling overwhelmed by it. And so because of that, then we often have the tendency to want to avoid it. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to hear about it. We certainly don't want to meditate on it, because I think it's common in the West to think that meditation is all about beautiful things, beautiful, pleasant things that will make us feel good, make us feel happy. So thinking about suffering certainly doesn't make us feel good, doesn't make us happy. So one problem there is that we don't fully understand the real purpose, the real reason of meditation in Buddhism. Meditation isn't just about feeling good. It isn't just to make us feel good, to make us feel happy, but it's to help us see the true nature of things, see reality, see things as they are. Because if we don't see things as we are, that is the cause of our suffering. That is the cause of our problems. So we have to be willing and courageous to look at the truth of things, the reality of things. And by looking at things in the right way, in a correct way, we'll be able to go through them and beyond them and eventually become free of suffering, free of our problems. But initially, that can be difficult to do. We have this resistance, we don't really want to look at these painful aspects of life. So we're going to be talking about that as we go along, how to deal with this topic of suffering without becoming unhappy, depressed, overwhelmed, and feel despair, but instead to deal with it in a way that gives us energy, gives us inspiration, helps us develop the qualities that we need to be able to progress along the path and eventually become enlightened and benefit others. That's the real purpose. That's the real purpose of looking at this topic of suffering and looking at, everything that the Buddha taught. The real purpose is to become free of suffering, not to suffer more. But I also read in one of the books of His Holiness where he said that, people who have a tendency to get depressed they may need to be careful about suffering and not think about it too much, because it might make them more depressed. And so he says, so be careful about that. Like if you notice thinking about suffering is making you more depressed, then you need to maybe back off a little bit, do something else to get yourself out of depression. So don't just keep pushing yourself, to keep going in that direction if it's not bringing about a good result. But if that happens, it may happen like in the course of this class tonight or on the weekend, if you do feel a sense of depression or despair or other kinds of very painful feelings coming up with regard to suffering, there are some remedies. One is to remember impermanence, the changing nature of things. Suffering is there, but it's impermanent. It's not permanent. It's not going to last forever. So if you can understand that and remind yourself of that, yes, there is suffering, but it's transitory, not permanent. It's not going to be there forever. There's a solution. Whatever problem there is, whatever painful thing there is, whatever suffering there is a solution. There are solutions. There are remedies, and we can become free of them. So reminding yourself of that might be helpful to stop feeling depressed. And also another thing that might be helpful, if you're familiar with the teachings on the precious human life, what we call precious human rebirth, the meaning of that is that, as human beings, we're in a very fortunate position, unlike a lot of other beings who are really suffering much more than we are, but don't have the same conditions and circumstances and abilities to get themselves out of suffering. So as human beings, with our bodies and our minds and our intelligence, and also the chance to learn about the path to enlightenment. So having all these conditions in our life means we are in a really, really good position to be able to get out of suffering. So there's a whole teaching about the precious human rebirth and a whole meditation on that. But just in brief, the point is that we're really fortunate. So yes, we have suffering, but we can do something about it. We can get ourselves out of it. So there's no need to feel despair, to feel depressed. So these are some things you can remind yourself of if you notice depression coming up, despair coming up, to try to counteract that. Okay, so suffering is the first of the Four Noble Truths. Why did the Buddha teach suffering first? So the order in which these four truths are explained is not necessarily the order in which they occur. They don't, they're not taught in a sequential order, because actually the second noble truth, the truth of the origin, comes first in terms of time, because the origin of suffering is that which brings about suffering. So the origin of suffering actually occurs first, and suffering occurs afterwards. So that's the actual order in which they occur. But the Buddha didn't teach them in that order. Instead, he taught suffering first. And the reason for that is because in terms of our practice, our feeling the wish to follow the path, to practice the path, and eventually reach liberation and enlightenment, we need to first understand and recognize suffering. Because if we don't, then we won't feel inspired or energized to look for the cause of suffering and then look for a way out of suffering. So it's actually necessary to first see suffering, recognize suffering, and that will impel us or motivate us to say, well, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? And what can I do about it? So it said that the order, suffering being taught first and then origin of suffering being taught second, is in terms of how we realize them, how we know them and understand them and realize them in our mind. And Geshe Tashi in the book says that only when we truly understand the difficulties that face us now and in the future, and how deep-rooted they are, will we begin to actively seek a way out of suffering. And we can see this in the life of the Buddha. Last week we looked a little bit at the Buddha's life and how in the beginning, for many years of his life, he had a very comfortable life, living in a palace, surrounded by all kinds of pleasures and beautiful people and entertainment and so forth. And it was only when he made these journeys outside of his palace and encountered people who were, somebody who was really, really sick, suffering from this really terrible illness, and then a person who was very old and suffering from the problems of old age, and then a funeral where he encountered death, someone who had died, and then the relatives and friends of that person grieving over the loss. So it's only when he encountered those aspects of suffering, the sufferings of life, that he began to look differently at his own life and at life in general in the world, and felt motivated to find a way to be free of suffering. And so the same may happen to us. I know for many people experiencing some difficulty in life, some really bad experience in life, losing a loved one, losing a parent, losing a partner, a child. So that's probably the worst type of suffering that we could experience, losing someone very, very dear to us. So that can be like a real shock to us. And of course, it's very, very painful, but it can also be beneficial in a way that it leads us to really question what life is all about, and what am I doing here, and why is there suffering, and so on. So it can lead us into taking an interest in meditation and the spiritual path. Like, for example, one person that I know, also from America, he told me that when he was in his 20s, he got cancer. And he said it was actually the best thing that happened to him in his life, because two beneficial things came out of it. One was that before that, he wasn't on very good terms with his family. He and his family didn't get along very well, but while he was going through the process of recovering, getting treatment and then recovering from cancer, he had to depend on his family. He stayed with his family, and during that time, they managed to heal the problems that they had. So he, became on very good terms, very close with his family. So those problems were cleared up. And the second beneficial thing was that he became interested in meditation and the spiritual path. So he started doing meditation, and then eventually, he recovered from his cancer, fortunately, and then he became a monk. And now he's living in a monastery in South India, studying the Tibetan, traditional Tibetan Geshe studies, and he's doing really well and really happy. So that's just an illustration of how facing some difficulty in life can be a catalyst, a doorway into the spiritual path. If things are going too well, if things are going really well in our life and we're not facing any problems, then we may not be interested in anything spiritual. Now, that's not true for everybody. I have met people who told me that they never had any big problems in their life, and yet they were still interested in meditation and following a spiritual path. So it may not work for everybody, but it does work for a lot of people like that. So then, with regard to the each of the four truths in the sutra taught by the Buddha, he speaks of each of the Four Noble Truths by way of three phases. So the first of the three phases is knowing each truth, just knowing what it is, identifying it, knowing its nature. And then the second of the three phases is, what is it we're supposed to do with regard to the truth? How should we practice in relation to each of the four truths? And then the third phase is what we accomplish with respect to each truth by learning about it and practicing it. What is accomplished? And so in the notes, I made a little chart pointing out these three things with respect to each of the four truths. So with respect to the first truth, the truth of suffering, also in the sutra, I added numbers at the beginning of each paragraph. So that wasn't in the original. I got this from the internet, by the way. There's so many things you can get on the internet. It's wonderful. Sutras, all the sutras. I don't know about all of them, but many sutras are available on the internet. And this particular translation of this sutra is made by a monk named Bhikkhu Bodhi. Bhikkhu means monk. Bodhi. He's an American from New York, and he's translated a lot of the sutras from the Pali language. So this is his translation. So I put these numbers there just to make it easy to refer to which paragraph we're on. So in the sutra, paragraph 4 is where the Buddha actually identifies the noble truth of suffering, the first noble truth. And we looked at this last week in the slide presentation. The Buddha just said, now this bhikkhus, he's talking to monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, and so forth. So he goes through the different examples of suffering. So that paragraph number 4, is where he's explaining the first of the three phases, the nature of suffering. And also paragraph number 8, if you have your copy of the sutra, he again mentions the nature of suffering. He says, this is the noble truth of suffering. And then the second of the three phases is what we are meant to do in relation to each of the four truths, how to practice. So with respect to the truth of suffering, what we're supposed to do is to understand it. So the Buddha says in paragraph number 9, he says, this noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Okay, so with each of the four truths, there's somewhat different way in which we need to work with it, to deal with it. So with regard to this first noble truth, what we need to do is to understand it, to understand suffering. And there's another book on the Four Noble Truths by, again, another American monk, Achan Sumedo. There's a book of his teachings on the Four Noble Truths, which again you can get on the internet. I sent you a little link for that. It's very nice. And he says that with regard to this, the second phase of understanding suffering, he says that what we need to do is to know suffering. And not run away from it, not, just try to avoid it or get rid of it, but to really stay with it, to really know it, to really get to understand it. And then the third phase of the first truth is what is accomplished by practicing, by understanding it. And the Buddha explains that in paragraph number 10. He says, this noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. So here he's talking about his experience. He's saying, I myself have understood suffering. I have come to have a full understanding of suffering. It's been fully understood. And when we get to that point of fully understanding suffering as it is, the real nature of suffering, this is the way in which we become free of it. So we don't become free of suffering by avoiding it, by just denying it, avoiding it, trying to run away from it, but by going into it and looking at it and understanding it and coming to see it as it really is. So that is the way to get beyond suffering, to get free of suffering. But as I mentioned before, this is a difficult thing to do, because when we hear about it or think about it, read about it, meditate on suffering, looking at the different types of suffering, different examples of suffering, whether they're in our own life or in the lives of others, in the world around us, and so on, it's difficult to do that without feeling some sadness, feeling some pain, some depression. And we need to remember that the real purpose of looking at suffering is not to suffer, but to get beyond suffering, to get free of suffering. And so the idea is that by looking at suffering, we will get motivated, inspired, energized to do what has to be done to become free of it. So that's the reason, that's the purpose for looking at suffering, is so that we feel, I really have to do something. I really have to do what needs to be done to become free of suffering. Does that make sense? So I think it's important to watch your mind, to observe your mind with regard to, like now when we're hearing about it, thinking about it, and also when we do meditation on suffering, to really be careful about how your mind is reacting, and try to be on the lookout for unhealthy reactions. So just some examples of unhealthy or unhelpful reactions that we might have with regard to suffering might be denial, wanting to deny it, wanting to, pretend it's not there, wanting to avoid it, to escape from it. And this is also something that happens in our life, of course, because when problems happen in our life, we may not always deal with them in such a healthy, helpful way, but we may have one of these unhelpful ways of dealing with it, like denial or wanting to escape from it. And there's so many escape routes, it's like so many ways that we can escape from our problems, like eating or sleeping or entertainment or working, keeping yourself busy doing things so you don't have to really face your problems. And entertainment. So especially now in the world, because there's so many things, so many ways in which we can run away from problems. So it's good to look at whether or not this is something we do when we're having a problem in our life. Are we really sitting down and facing it and dealing with it in a healthy way, or are we just trying to avoid it, trying to escape from it? On the other hand, maybe the other extreme from denial and trying to avoid it would be to become overwhelmed by it. Like if we do open up to suffering, whether it's our own suffering or the suffering in the world, hearing about all these terrible things that happen in the world, sometimes when we open up to that and really pay attention to that, we may find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, feeling burned out, feeling even despair, depression, grief, sadness, and so on. And that's not helpful either. Because if that happens, then we may lose our energy to do something about it. We may feel, well, there's just so much suffering, there's nothing that I can do about it. So we may kind of sink into a state of depression and not have the energy to do things, to overcome suffering for ourselves and others. Other things that might happen, we might become angry about suffering, we might blame others, or we might indulge in self-pity. So watch out for these and see if you are prone to any of these unhealthy attitudes. And if you are, recognize that they are unhealthy attitudes and try to unlearn them and learn more healthy attitudes. And there's this wonderful sutra, it's another sutra from the Pali tradition called the Salata Sutra, which you can also find on the internet. And it's a really short, kind of simple little teaching in which the Buddha said that when we have a problem, when some kind of problem, suffering, bad experience happens to us, it's like being hit with an arrow. And of course, being hit with an arrow is painful, right? There's pain there, there's suffering there. But he says what can happen is sometimes we shoot ourselves with more arrows, second arrows. And this is, this is an analogy to certain types of attitudes that we may have in response to problems. So if we have a problem, there's a problem there in our life, then on top of that problem, already bad enough having that one problem, but then on top of that, we may get upset, we may try to run away, we may get angry, we may blame people, we may blame ourselves and think, oh, I'm just such a horrible person, you know, I keep running into problems all the time and it's all my fault and so on. So we just have all these unhelpful attitudes that just build up on top of the problem, make things worse. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Is that clear? Yeah. So he says this is like shooting ourselves with a second arrow or a third arrow or fourth arrow, right? And he says this is not a skillful thing to do. Instead, what we should do is learn to just sit with the original problem and learn to deal with that in a healthy way. And don't just add all these additional problems, which are just like second arrows. And I wanted to mention a little book that I came across last year. It's a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. It was just published last year, I think. It is called No Mud, No Lotus. And the subtitle is The Art of Transforming Suffering. So it's all about how to, I mean, he does mention in here this analogy of the arrows and, you know, the Buddha's advice to learn to stop shooting ourselves with more arrows and instead to just deal in a healthy and realistic way with our suffering. So the whole book is about that. And it's very short and simple and sweet and very inspiring. So just to give an example, he says that when we have suffering, instead of trying to avoid it or run away from it or deny it or get upset about it, just sit with it and say hello. Say hello to your suffering. So this is quite counterintuitive. I know for myself, when I have some problem, what I say is go away, get lost. I don't want you around. So the idea of saying hello to my suffering and, you know, treating it like a friend, like a guest is something very different than our usual reaction. But when I try what he advises, it really works. It's like magic. You know, if you can stop fighting with the problem and just accept it, say hello to it, welcome it, be with it, sit with it. And then you can use, there are other things you can do as well with the suffering. For example, many of you are probably familiar with the Tibetan practices of mind training, thought transformation on how we can work with suffering. For example, thinking about how I'm not the only one in the world who has suffering, but there's so many other people as well who have suffering. Many others have suffering as well. And then we can practice tonglen, taking on the suffering of others. Or even if you're not ready to do that, just to take on your own suffering. You can just say to yourself, I accept this suffering. I will bear this suffering. I will go through the suffering. And by doing that, may the suffering and the causes of suffering of all other people and all other beings disappear. May all of them be free of their suffering. Okay, so that's something you could just, you know, do in just a couple of minutes. It's very short, very fast, very simple. And it really makes a difference. If you can do that with your mind, changing your mind, changing your thoughts, it really makes a big difference. You won't suffer so much. You'll notice that you're not suffering so much. And Sogyal Rinpoche tells a story about this in his book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. He has a whole section in there on tonglen, taking and giving. And mentions that there was one man in New York who was an artist, and he had AIDS, and he was actually dying of AIDS. And he wasn't interested in meditation or spiritual practices or anything like that. But a friend of him told him about this practice of Tonglen, a simple way of practicing Tonglen, and he started doing it. And he found it was so helpful, because before that he had this suffering, and he felt like this suffering is completely useless. It's just useless to have this suffering. So on top of this suffering, he also had this feeling of kind of despair or depression or, uselessness. So the practice of Tonglen gave him a sense of usefulness. There's something useful about this suffering. I can use this suffering for something useful, something beneficial, something helpful. So it really transformed his whole attitude about the suffering that he was going through, and really helped him a lot. So even if the suffering itself didn't go away, it was still there, but his mind, his attitude was able to change towards it. So he had just the first arrow, we could say, the first arrow, but not the second and third arrows and so on. And there's also a book by Lama Zopa Rinpoche about how to transform suffering into happiness. Are you familiar with that book? I think it's called Transforming Suffering into Happiness. No? Yes? Yeah. That's a wonderful book. So there's all kinds of methods. That's the good news. The good news is there are methods for how we can deal with suffering, problems that happen in our life, so that instead of becoming unhappy and depressed and overwhelmed, we can use these problems and actually make them part of our practice and use them to get closer to enlightenment. And when we do manage to use our problems in this way, then we'll find that we're not suffering so much. Okay, so then, as the Buddha said, what we need to do with regard to suffering is to understand it, to understand suffering. And so the way to do that is to meditate on suffering. So you probably encountered this before. For example, in the Lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, there's a whole section of different enumerations of suffering, different types of suffering. And we are advised to meditate on these. And again, the point is not to make ourselves suffer more, but to really see the truth, the reality of suffering in our life and in the lives of others in the world around us, which is what we call samsara, cyclic existence, unenlightened existence, so that we will then be motivated to get ourselves out of this situation. Because if we don't recognize the suffering that we are in, the suffering situation that we are in, we won't want to get out of it. We won't want to do anything to free ourselves. We'll just stay here. We'll just be stuck here. So maybe before I continue, do you want to have a little break?
Yeah.
5-minute break? Okay, so let's have 5-minute break, and then we'll continue.
Yeah.
Oh, so I thought maybe we could do some meditation now, since you just had a break. Maybe you're feeling a little bit more refreshed and energized. So try to sit with a straight back, whether you're in a chair or sitting on the floor. It's a good idea to keep our back straight because, sorry, that will help us have a more clear and focused and alert state of mind. But at the same time, try not to be tense. Don't hold your body in a tense or tight way. So try to be relaxed, but still upright. And another point is, if you might be feeling tired, sleepy, and when we close our eyes to meditate, that can lead to sleepiness. And it's best to avoid that, to try to stay awake during meditation. So if you think you might become sleepy, then it's better not to close your eyes completely, but instead leave them open a little bit. So there's light coming into your eyes, and that can help you to stay awake and alert. And just have your eyes looking down onto your lap or onto the floor in front of you. And that way there's less chance of being distracted by things you might see in the room around you. So let's take a look at our usual or typical way of responding when problems, suffering happen in our life. So see if you can bring to mind some experience you had, preferably something recent so that it's still somewhat fresh in your mind, where some unwanted experience happened in your life. It could have been a problem with your own body, some physical problem, sickness, pain, discomfort. Maybe you hurt yourself somehow. Or it may have been a problem in relationship with somebody else, somebody doing something or saying something that was hurtful or irritating to you. So it could be any kind of problem, but something unpleasant, something unwanted that happened to you. So try to remember this, and then as you're thinking about this problem, see if you can look at your mind and how your mind responded, How did you feel when this problem happened? And see if you can look out for any of the things that I mentioned before, such as wanting to avoid it, to deny it, to escape from it, or getting angry, blaming, or self-pity, feeling sorry for yourself, oh, poor me, or being overwhelmed, feeling depressed, feeling despair, maybe blaming yourself, thinking, oh, I'm such an idiot, something like that. So just try to notice if any of those unhealthy, unhelpful ways of responding arose in your mind. And you may have had more than one of them. You may have had a number of them. So just try to recognize that. So the Buddha in the Salata Sutra said that these secondary reactions that we have to problems, to unwanted experiences, are like shooting ourselves with more arrows on top of the first arrow, which is the problem itself. And so instead of helping, we are making things worse. Having these secondary reactions, these extra reactions, these painful reactions, is just making more suffering for ourselves rather than helping the situation. So see if you can recognize if that is true. And we can learn to respond to problems, unwanted experiences in ways that are more helpful, more healthy, and compatible with the path, the spiritual path, spiritual practice, and that will actually help us move along the path and get closer to liberation, to enlightenment. So one thing we can do is when an unwanted experience happens to us, to simply say to ourselves, oh, this is suffering. This is the first noble truth that the Buddha spoke about. This is an example of that. And then we can think about how suffering is a natural part of life, of unenlightened existence, which we are in. It's something that happens to everybody. I'm not the only one in the world who has suffering, who has problems. Everybody has it. So it's something we have in common with all people, with all beings who are not enlightened. And the Buddha explained that it's possible to become free of suffering, to reach a point where we no longer experience problems, unwanted experiences. And he taught a way to do this, a path that leads to the cessation of suffering. But that's not something we can achieve in just one moment. It takes time. But being aware of suffering and recognizing how painful it is, how unpleasant it is, can give us the energy, the inspiration, the motivation to learn more about the Buddha's teachings and put them into practice so that we can achieve the freedom from suffering that the Buddha explained. But of course, that doesn't mean that if there is a solution to the problem, that we don't apply the solution. Of course, if there's something we can do to stop our suffering, to relieve our suffering, we can do that. But sometimes that's not always possible, or it may take some time. So we might be stuck with this problem, this suffering, for a period of time. But while it's there, there are things we can do to make it less painful and even make it more positive. For example, we can say to ourselves, everybody has suffering and nobody wants suffering. And I would like to relieve the suffering of others. I would like to help them become free of suffering. And then we can courageously decide to accept this suffering we're experiencing instead of trying to run away from it or push it away from ourselves. To just say to ourselves, I accept this suffering. And by doing that, by myself accepting and bearing and going through this suffering, may the suffering and the causes of suffering of everyone, all people, all beings, may they disappear. May everyone become free of their suffering. So just see if bringing that thought into your mind, saying those words to yourself, makes any difference with regard to the way you feel about this problem. Okay, so when you're ready, you can open your eyes and relax. See, the point is that even if we are following the path very seriously to the best of our ability, as much as we possibly can, nevertheless, it takes a long time to reach enlightenment, to reach nirvana, and to reach the state of being free of suffering. And along the way, it's inevitable that we will face suffering, that we will experience suffering. It's unavoidable. You look at the biographies, the stories of all the great masters, the Buddha himself, Milarepa, and so on. They all had difficulties, hardships in their life. So nobody can get to enlightenment or get to nirvana or get to higher states of mind and have an easy time all the way, not experience any difficulties. So, so that's inevitable. We're going to have problems as we go. But the problems we experience don't have to be bad. You know, we can learn how to work with them, how to deal with them in a way that they don't get us down, they don't get us depressed, we don't get angry, depressed, and so on. Instead, we can use them. We can use them in ways that help us along the path, that help us get closer to enlightenment. So that's the point. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a middle way of dealing with suffering. Instead of denying it or trying to avoid it, run away from it, escape from it, on the one hand, or becoming overwhelmed by it on the other hand, there are ways we can face it, deal with it, and actually transform it, make it into something useful for ourselves and for others. Because if we can learn to do this with our problems, we'll be able to help other people do it with their problems. And it will help us get to enlightenment more quickly. And then we'll be able to really help others in the best possible way. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left. So yeah, there are these different lists of suffering. And what I'm going to do on the weekend, because like we have the whole day, I will lead some meditations on these different types of suffering, how to meditate on them. So one of the lists is in terms of 8 types of suffering. And these are actually the ones mentioned in this sutra, the sutra on the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, when the Buddha is pointing out the truth of suffering. He says, birth is suffering, aging is suffering. This is paragraph 4 if you have your copy. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing. Union is an interesting word. Anyway, usually it said encountering or meeting what is displeasing is suffering. So that just means, for example, people, there's certain people that are difficult to get along with that we wish we didn't have to meet, but nevertheless we meet them. And sometimes we even have to work with them or, meet them again and again. So that's an example of meeting with what is displeasing. So that's number 5. Then separation from what is pleasing. So that can include all experiences of loss that we have, whether it's losing people, losing loved ones, or losing our possessions, our property, losing a job, losing your health, losing your eyesight, losing your ability to hear, and so on. So any kind of loss that we experience in life, usually that's quite painful. And not getting what we want. So that includes all the experiences where we want something very much. It could be wanting to be in a relationship with a particular person, wanting a particular job, wanting a promotion or a raise, or wanting to live in a specific place, a house, but we don't manage to get this thing that we want. So not getting what we want, that's suffering. And then the last one the Buddha mentions is the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. So that's a little more difficult to understand. Just spend a little bit of time on that. Do you know what the 5 aggregates are? Basically, body and mind. Yeah, that's kind of boiling him down into two, body and mind. But the five, Buddha did mention five. So, anyone know what the five are? Or any of the five? No. So the first is the traditional terminology is form, and form refers to our body, physical body. So it includes all the physical parts of us. And the other four aggregates are all aspects of the mind, mental aggregates. So one is feelings. So feeling here in the Buddhist explanation, it doesn't include all the different kinds of feelings that we normally talk about, but basically just three very basic kinds of reactions that we have to things. So there's pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neutral feeling. So it's said that every time we have an experience, whether it's with any of our six senses, seeing, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and the mental sense, the thinking, remembering, and so on. So any experience that we have, any encounter with an object, there's always an object. Whenever we have any of the six experiences, there's always an object. So there's always one of the three types of feelings: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So that means whatever we see, even just looking at the carpet, okay, we have that experience of seeing the carpet. One of those three types of feelings is going to be there: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So some people might feel pleasant looking at the carpet. Some people might feel unpleasant, like it's really ugly. Some people may feel neutral, like neither good nor bad. Okay. And the same with hearing sounds. Whenever we hear a sound, like now I'm talking, so you hear the sound of my voice. Maybe for some of you it's pleasant, some of you it's unpleasant. For some of you it may be neutral, neither good nor bad. And the same with smell, taste, bodily sensations, tactile sensations. There's always one of those three feelings present. And also with our mental experiences, like our thoughts, our fantasies, our memories, whatever's going on in our mind, always one of those three feelings is present. And this aggregative feeling is a particularly important one, because it's said that in an ordinary unenlightened person, a person who's not very mindful and so on, when we have a pleasant feeling, it usually leads to attachment, grasping, craving, clinging. I want more of that. I want more of that. When we have an unpleasant feeling, it usually leads to aversion, dislike, hatred, anger. Yeah. So that's another kind of disturbing state of mind. And then the neutral feelings that we have, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, they usually perpetuate ignorance, because we don't see, like the carpet, we don't see the true nature of the carpet. So we have a neutral feeling about it, and, okay, yeah, it's there. I don't really like it or dislike it, but we still see it in a mistaken way. We don't see the truth or reality of the carpet, how it really is. So these three types of feelings then tend to give rise to and perpetuate the three poisonous states of mind, of attachment, aversion, and ignorance. So part of the practice of meditation is to try to observe one's mind and observe one's feelings, and try to stop this process, this normal process of feelings leading to the three poisons. I have to be very mindful to do that, but it is possible. Okay, so then the third of the aggregates is called discrimination. And this is also an aspect of the mind, a mental factor. And it's that part of the mind that simply differentiates one thing from another. with regard to colors, for example, when we look at different colors, we can say that's blue and that's red and that's, I don't know, gray, and this is white and this is yellow and so on. So it's a aspect of the mind that can distinguish or differentiate one thing from another. Okay, just on a very basic level, even before we start giving names, even before we say blue, yellow, red, and so on. But it's able to distinguish one thing from another. And then on top of that, we can give names to things. And then the fourth aggregate is called compositional factors. And that is like a bag that includes a whole bunch of things. All the other mental factors, all of our emotions, disturbing emotions, negative ones like anger and attachment and so on, as well as positive ones like love and compassion and faith and so on. So everything that doesn't fit into the other aggregates goes into that one, compositional factors. And then the fifth aggregate is called consciousness. And that includes our 6 primary basic minds or consciousnesses, just seeing, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. So those are the 5 aggregates. And in a simple way, we can put them into 2, like body and mind. Okay, but the Buddha did make this expansion into 5, and there's reasons for that. So anyway, the 5 aggregates is just a way of explaining what we are, what makes us up as a person. Each one of us has a set of these 5 aggregates, or we could say a body and a mind. This is what is there. And our 5 aggregates, as long as we are unenlightened beings, come into existence in dependence on various factors, causes and conditions. And in our case, because we're unenlightened, their main causes and conditions that give rise to our 5 aggregates are faulty things, delusions, afflictive emotions like greed, hatred, ignorance, and karma. And because the causes and conditions that give rise to our 5 aggregates, they are faulty. They are, the word that's usually used is contaminated. They're not kind of good things. They're kind of negative things. Because of that, then our 5 aggregates themselves are in the nature of suffering. Our body and mind are in the nature of suffering. As soon as we are born, as soon as we come into existence, we already start to suffer. We have physical suffering, pain, discomfort, sickness, aging, death. Okay, so this just comes with the package of this body and mind. And we also have mental suffering. We have unhappiness. I mean, you look at a little baby crying. Babies sometimes smile and laugh, yes, but they also cry. And they're suffering. Okay, so right from the beginning of life, there's suffering, physical suffering, mental suffering. So as long as we have this set of aggregates, body and mind, that come into existence due to karma and afflictions, then we experience suffering. And so this is the 8 types of suffering. And there's also a list of 3, but we don't have time to go into those tonight. So I'll do that on the weekend. And also do some meditation on them to get more familiar, more understanding of them. So we have a little bit of time left. So if anyone would like to ask a question about anything I've spoken about that's not clear.
In the aggregate of consciousness, there are the 5 senses. So there's also the 6th aspect of mind itself.
6th, yeah. Sometimes it's called the 6th sense, but maybe 6th consciousness is better.
So how we then learn, because I think most of us know what it is to smell, see, touch, and all that, but I guess part of our work is to really investigate what that mind
The
has
6th,
to do.
the 6th one.
Yeah.
Well, that's all of our thoughts. thoughts and memories, and also emotions. I think most of the time, if not all the time, when we have emotions, when we're happy or unhappy, we feel love, we feel anger, we feel whatever emotions, that those are mostly involved with the sixth consciousness. And it is hard, like what they say is, okay, our five senses, they're kind of active, especially, I think, seeing. The visual sense is probably the most active one, and maybe number two is hearing, taste and smell, when we're eating, but they're not too, we don't have too many of those. Bodily sense, that's a pretty big one too. So what normally happens is we have, these sensory experiences, and then quickly, very shortly after seeing something or hearing something, the mind switches into the sixth sense. We start thinking, we start conceptualizing, even giving names, even to say that's a carpet, that's red, that's blue. This is the sixth sense that does that. It's not the visual sense. So our eye sense doesn't say this is red, this is blue, this is a carpet, this is a pillow. That's our mental consciousness. So it's like really fast, the switch from raw sense perceptions to the mental sense and conceptual thinking and so on. So, that's part of the purpose of meditation, is to become more aware, to really pay attention to our mind, our experiences, so that we can start to differentiate these different states of mind, different things that are going on. And like I say, part of the process is to look out for how feelings give rise to emotions, attachment, mainly attachment, aversion. That's happening so much all day, all the time. I like this, I don't like that. And that just increases our suffering. So we can't immediately stop this process, but even to be aware that it's happening and not immediately buy into it, feed into it, increase it, that's very helpful.
You say that these five aggregates come into existence, but they are always there, right? They are kind of some mechanism, isn't it?
Well, when I say come into existence, I mean like we're born, right?
Yeah.
So our life starts in our mother's womb, the moment of conception, and according to Buddhism, the process of our coming into existence, of course, it's dependent on our mother and father meeting, falling in love, making love, and so on. But a big part of that is the previous mind. Our mind was existing before conception. We had another life, and then that life came to an end, and the mind or consciousness separated from that body, that life, it wasn't going to continue. Mind separated from that body and then entered into the womb of our mother at the moment of conception. And so there was this strong impetus from that mind, from our karma, our afflictions, our wish to exist, that was an essential component for our life to begin. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a very different explanation than what we have in the West, where it's pretty much just biological. Yeah, and Western science says you have the elements from the mother and the father, and that gives rise to the baby and the brain, and the mind comes from the brain. But according to Buddhism, it's not like that. The mind already existed before, and factors within the mind, the consciousness, propelled it to be born, to be the child of our parents. And so that's where the karma and the afflictions, the afflictive emotions come from. If we didn't have this strong wish to be born and the karma to be born, we wouldn't have been born. We would be off in nirvana, so enlightenment.
So for a Buddha, what would happen to the 5 aggregates? Would they be controlled or would they disappear?
What do you mean? What do you mean a Buddha? You mean when he?
An enlightened person.
Well, an enlightened person. This is a little complicated because there's different explanations in the different schools. So according to our school, Mahayana school, we would say that an enlightened person, like the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. Last week I told the story of the Buddha's life and enlightenment, but according to the Theravada tradition. But according to the Mahayana tradition, Buddha had already attained enlightenment previously, before he was born as Siddhartha. He was enlightened in some Pure Land many eons before. And then he just came into this world and showed the aspect, he showed the aspect of being born as Prince Siddhartha and then going through this whole process of becoming enlightened under the Bodhi tree and so on, and then teaching. So that was, he was already enlightened. So it's a somewhat different explanation. And so for an enlightened being, their aggregates are not the same as ours. Ours are considered to be quite, gross and coming from karma and delusions. But in the case of an enlightened being, even though they do have a body and a mind, and they're walking around and appearing like us and eating and so forth, but it's a very different situation than we have. They're pure aggregates, not contaminated aggregates. I don't know if that's making it easier or more complicated. They say even a bodhisattva, an Arya bodhisattva, when a bodhisattva gains a direct realization of emptiness and becomes an Arya, their aggregates change. They no longer have the same kind of body and mind that they had before. They become purified. It's difficult to understand, but the point is the kind of body and the kind of mind that we have are very much dependent on or affected by mental aspects, such as our afflictions, our ignorance, our delusions, our karma, and so forth. So as long as what gives rise to our body and mind are contaminated or impure factors, then our body and mind will also be contaminated and impure and in the nature of suffering. Does that make sense?
I have a question about renunciation. I guess you could say that all of Buddhism traces back to the first noble truth, right? The truth of suffering, more or less. But
well, you can't isolate the first noble truth. The four are all.
It's a package.
It's a package, yeah. And if we only had the first noble truth, then things would be pretty depressing. Yeah. But there is a cause of suffering, and there's a way to eliminate it, and there's a path to get there. So
this contemplation we did tonight on the first noble truth specifically, how does that relate to renunciation? Is that like the basis of renunciation?
Well, I'll talk about renunciation later. It's a big topic. We don't really have time, but the term renunciation can also be called the determination to be free, which I think is a kind of more positive way of focusing on it in a more positive way, the determination to be free of suffering. And so this is a state of mind that comes about when you see that there is suffering and you don't want to have suffering, you want to be free of suffering, but you want to do it in the wise way, not just running away from it or, indulging in sense pleasure or whatever, but, to really look at the causes of suffering and eliminate the causes of suffering. So getting rid of suffering from the root. And the way to do that is to follow the path. So renunciation is really the the motivation that gets us to follow the spiritual path in a short way. But yes, definitely the way to generate renunciation is to meditate on suffering, to look at suffering and really understand it, as the Buddha said, to really understand suffering. Not just in a superficial way, but in a deep way. Okay, so we'll stop there for tonight, and I hope, we'll carry on Saturday for those who can join. And even if you can't come here to participate here, you can do it on your own. I think the videos will be online, will be on the YouTube channel, so you can do it at home as well. So we'll continue with this teaching and also have meditations on it. And then we'll continue again next week here. Okay, so let's take a few moments to make a dedication of the positive energy we've created here tonight by coming together, having a positive motivation, wishing to be of benefit not only to ourselves but to others as much as we can, to bring about relief of suffering, bring about peace and happiness, and bring about enlightenment for all living beings. So, and then listening and meditating on and trying to understand these teachings. So we've definitely created some good energy, some positive energy here tonight. Merit, we call this merit. This is the cause of happiness, and we can share this merit with others. And so remember that initial motivation that we had of wanting to benefit others, and let's imagine sharing the positive energy we've created with others, wishing that it will be the cause of happiness and peace and freedom from suffering for all living beings. Okay, so thank you. Good night. And the Saturday event will start at 11 because the time difference between here and Helsinki will be 10 o'clock there, but it'll be 11 here. Those who want to join.